late afternoon in Sheridan, Wyoming. November light cuts low across the hilltop, turning the red brick facade the color of dried blood. 3 stories of Flemish gables and curvilinear arches cast shadows across manicured lawns where nothing grows wild anymore. Inside, 30 rooms sit perfectly preserved behind leaded glass windows, each piece of furniture positioned exactly where it stood 90 years ago, as if the family simply vanished mid-sentence. The third-floor ballroom stretches silent and vast, built to hold 100 dancers, but now holding only the weight of what was paid to fill it. John B. Kendrick believed a man could build his way out of poverty, that enough brick and mahogany and imported limestone could transform a Texas orphan into Wyoming royalty. He was right about transformation. The mansion on Clarendon Avenue proved you could buy immortality if you were willing to let someone else pay the maintenance. Was Trail End the crowning achievement of the American dream, or the monument to everyone who bled building it? If you're fascinated by the dark history behind America's most extravagant mansions and the hidden cost of Gilded Age wealth, hit that like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me which controversial estate I should investigate next. Your support keeps these deep dive investigations coming. Let's begin. The hill overlooks downtown Sheridan like a judge's bench overlooks a courtroom. From the circular drive, you can see the whole grid of the city spreading below, the railroad tracks cutting through like a scar, the distant mountains holding their snow even in summer. John Kendrick chose this spot deliberately. Visibility meant power. Height meant distance from the people who worked for you. 3.8 acres of elevated ground, removed from the noise and smell of downtown, but close enough that anyone looking up would see the mansion and understand who owned it. He purchased the land in 1895 for a price nobody recorded, which itself tells you something about how transactions worked when you had money and connections. Public records were suggestions, not requirements. What mattered was whether other powerful men acknowledged your claim, and by 1895, Kendrick had accumulated enough influence that his claims went unchallenged. By 1908, when construction began, Kendrick had already transformed himself from a 22-year-old trailhand into one of Wyoming's wealthiest men. The journey from Texas orphan to cattle baron took 29 years of calculated risk and relentless accumulation. The cattle empire that funded Trail End stretched across 210,000 acres of deeded and leased land spanning 2 states, from southeastern Montana down through northern Wyoming. It included the O.W. Ranch on Hanging Woman Creek in Montana, where Kendrick lived before moving to Sheridan, the LX Bar on the Powder River, where he built stone structures that rivaled Trail End in ambition if not in finish, the K Ranch, which served as the center of his winter range and irrigation operations, the 76, the Forks, Hanging Woman, the 77, Cabin Creek. Each property had its own manager, its own crew of permanent and seasonal workers, its own buildings constructed from local stone by men whose names don't appear in any ledger. The logistics of managing an operation that size were staggering. It took a full day on horseback to ride from the OW to the LX Bar. During busy seasons, Kendrick and his son Manville and Eula's brother Clarence Wolfian would travel from ranch to ranch, checking operations, making decisions about breeding and culling and marketing, ensuring that distant managers weren't making errors that would cost the company money. They needed adequate housing not just for permanent staff but for overnight guests, itinerant workers, the extended family members who showed up expecting accommodation because family meant obligation in ways that went beyond blood ties. They needed barns and corrals and processing facilities and storage buildings and housing for the horses that made all movement possible before automobiles became reliable in rough country. The empire required infrastructure on a scale most ranchers never attempted. Kendrick built an entire canal system to bring water to land that would otherwise support minimal grazing. The Kendrick Canal ran for miles, hand-dug by crews working with shovels and wheelbarrows and animal-drawn equipment that feels primitive now but represented cutting-edge efficiency in the early 1900s. The canal meant irrigation. Irrigation meant hay. Hay meant winter feeding. Winter feeding meant the cattle survived when natural grass was buried under snow, which meant higher survival rates and better weight gain and more calves in the spring. The mathematics were elegant if you had enough capital to wait years for return on investment. The mathematics of wealth creation in early 20th century Wyoming were straightforward if you understood them and had the stomach to execute. Land was cheap if you got there first, or knew who to pay, or were willing to wait out the people who got there before you. Cattle multiplied if you had enough range to prevent overgrazing, enough water to keep them alive through summer drought, enough hay to feed them through winter, and enough market access to sell them before prices crashed. Labor was abundant if you didn't ask where it came from or what happened when it wore out, if you understood that men were desperate enough to accept almost any terms when the alternative was starvation. Kendrick understood the formula better than most because he'd lived it from the bottom. He'd started with nothing, which meant he knew exactly what nothing looked like, every dimension of it, the hunger and the uncertainty and the knowledge that one bad break could send you back to zero. He was determined never to see it again, and that determination shaped every decision he made for the rest of his life. Born September 6, 1857, near Rusk, Texas, in Cherokee County, John Benjamin Kendrick was the son of John Harvey Kendrick and Anna May, ranchers who worked land they didn't own. The family was poor even by frontier standards. Young John attended public school in Florence, Texas, through 7th grade, then quit because the family needed his labor more than his education. He learned to read and write and do basic arithmetic, skills that put him ahead of many cowboys, but far behind the formally educated men he would later compete against in business and politics. His parents died when he was young. The exact circumstances are unclear, lost to time or deliberately obscured by a man who preferred his success story without the messiness of early trauma. By his mid-teens, Kendrick was an orphan working for room and board, breaking horses for ranchers who paid him in food and shelter because cash was scarce and labor was cheap. He learned the cattle business from the ground up, the hard physical work of riding and roping and branding, the endless routine of moving animals and fixing fence, and dealing with weather that could kill you or your stock with equal indifference. In March 1879, at age 21, Kendrick was hired by Charles W. Wolfian to help move a herd of cattle from Matagorda Bay on the Gulf Coast of Texas to Wyoming Territory, a distance of roughly 1,500 miles through country that ranged from brutal to deadly depending on the season and your luck. The pay was minimal, the conditions were worse. Trail drives tested men in ways that sorted the competent from the reckless and the determined from the merely desperate. You spent months in the saddle, sometimes 18 hours a day, eating dust and bad food, sleeping on the ground, bathing never, dealing with stampedes and river crossings and storms that turned the sky black and sent cattle running in every direction while lightning wrote illuminated serpents across the ground around your horse's ears. Kendrick described it years later with the careful understatement of someone who'd survived what others hadn't. Anything at night, almost a stumbling horse, the odor of some wild animal or a blinding flash of lightning would start the herd to running. Then the cowboys would have to follow. Sometimes the cattle would run until morning, or they might stop now and then for a few minutes. Whereupon, of course, we would halt with them, the rain meanwhile coming down in torrents, and the night being so black that nothing could be seen but the electricity on our horse's ear or the lightning wriggling over the ground like illuminated serpents. The drive brought him to Wyoming Territory in August 1879. The herd reached the running water range. Kendrick looked around and decided this was where his trail ended and his future began. The territory was opening up, still dangerous but marginally less dangerous than it had been a decade earlier. The Lakota and Cheyenne had been forced onto reservations. The buffalo were nearly extinct, killed systematically to destroy indigenous food sources and open the range for cattle. What remained was grass, endless grass, free for anyone with the nerve to claim it and the strength to hold it. Kendrick's first Wyoming home was on the Charles Wolfian Ranch north of Cheyenne, which is how he met his future father-in-law and gained the connection that would prove crucial to his advancement. He became foreman of Wolfian's outfit, responsible for managing crews and making decisions about where to graze and when to sell. He proved good at it. He understood cattle, and he understood men, and he understood the intersection between the two, how to push workers hard enough to maximize productivity without pushing so hard they quit or made mistakes that cost money. Later, he relocated to a ranch near Lusk, where he hired on as foreman of the Converse Cattle Company, a large operation running out of east-central Wyoming with absentee owners in Chicago and Milwaukee who cared about profits and nothing else. This was common in the cattle boom of the 1880s, Eastern and Midwestern money poured into Western ranching based on wildly optimistic projections about returns and minimal understanding of actual conditions. Investors thought cattle raised themselves and multiplied geometrically and sold for prices that kept climbing forever. The reality was harder. Cattle died from disease and weather. Markets crashed. Operating costs exceeded projections. Many of the early operations were fundamentally Ponzi schemes, showing paper profits based on theoretical herd growth, while actual animals starved or froze or got stolen. Kendrick was smart enough to see this. While other foremen took their wages and spent them in town, Kendrick saved everything. While others accepted their position as permanent employees, Kendrick convinced his employers to let him run his own small herd alongside company cattle, a practice most ranches forbade because it meant the hired help might someday become competition. He argued that his personal stake would make him more invested in the company's success, that he'd watch costs more carefully if some of the profit was his. The absentee owners, knowing nothing about cattle operations and caring less, agreed. Between 1879, when he arrived with a trail herd from Texas, and 1908, when he broke ground on Trail End, Kendrick built his fortune through a combination of shrewd land acquisition, strategic partnerships, ruthless efficiency, and what his contemporaries called good timing, but what might more accurately be described as being willing to do what others wouldn't when opportunity presented itself disguised as disaster. The winter of 1886 to 1887 destroyed most of Wyoming's cattle industry and made John Kendrick rich. Blizzards and temperatures that dropped to 40 below zero killed an estimated 90% of the territory's cattle. The snow started in November and didn't stop. It fell day after day, week after week, accumulating to depths that buried grass and prevented cattle from grazing. When brief thaws came, the snow would melt enough to create a crust, then freeze again, locking the vegetation under an armor of ice that cattle couldn't break with their hooves or mouths. Starving animals huddled against fence lines and creek bottoms, and anywhere that offered minimal shelter from winds that sucked heat from their bodies faster than their failing metabolisms could generate it. They died by the thousands, by the tens of thousands, by the hundreds of thousands across Montana, Wyoming, Dakota Territory, Nebraska. Spring revealed the full extent of the catastrophe. Carcasses piled in gullies and along waterways, so many dead cattle that the land itself seemed made of bones. Cowboys riding through areas that should have held thriving herds found nothing but corpses and a few wild-eyed survivors too weak to stand. Ranchers who had overextended themselves, who had borrowed against inflated herd values, who had gambled on endless growth and never-ending high prices, found themselves ruined overnight. Operations that looked prosperous on paper in October were bankrupt by April. Banks foreclosed. Investors pulled out. The cattle boom that had seemed unstoppable in 1885 was finished 2 years later, killed by weather that didn't care about financial projections or manifest destiny, or the ambitions of men who thought they could tame the West through will and capital alone. Kendrick was not ruined. He was foreman of the Converse Cattle Company at the time, working for absentee owners in Chicago and Milwaukee who knew nothing about cattle and cared less about the men who managed them. While other operations collapsed around him, Kendrick kept the OW profitable. He'd been conservative where others were reckless. He'd maintained hay reserves where others assumed grass would always be available. He'd kept realistic counts of actual cattle instead of inflating numbers to please owners or justify borrowing. When the winter hit, his management meant more animals survived, and more surviving animals meant the company stayed solvent when competitors died. This gave him leverage. The absentee owners needed Kendrick more than he needed them. He'd proven himself during crisis. He'd delivered profits when everyone else delivered excuses. He convinced his employers to let him run his own small herd alongside company cattle, cutting himself in on a piece of the operation as compensation for success. This wasn't generosity from the owners. It was calculation. They understood that giving Kendrick a personal stake meant he'd protect their investment more carefully, that his own profit would align with theirs, that he'd watch costs and maximize returns because every dollar saved or earned benefited him directly. The arrangement worked exactly as Kendrick planned. He saved everything he earned. Every dollar from his wages plus every penny of profit from his personal herd got reinvested in more cattle. He lived cheap, worked constantly, and accumulated capital with the patience of someone who understood that wealth wasn't built in single spectacular moves, but in thousands of small, consistent decisions that compounded over time. Other cowboys spent their pay on liquor and women, and whatever momentary pleasures helped them forget the grinding hardship of their work. Kendrick famously washed and mended his own socks rather than throwing them out like other men did, saving pennies that added up to dollars, that added up to investment capital, that added up to ownership. In 1889, Kendrick moved the entire OW operation from Wyoming to Hanging Woman Creek in southeastern Montana's Bighorn County, near what would become the town of Decker. He moved cattle, horses, cowboys, equipment, everything. Montana offered what depleted Wyoming couldn't: plenty of water, abundant forage, room for expansion. The move demonstrated vision and confidence. Most foremen would have stayed where they were, following familiar patterns. Kendrick saw better opportunity elsewhere and had the authority to pursue it because the absentee owners trusted his judgment more than their own. By 1897, he bought them out for $38,000. The price included all the company's remaining cattle at $17 a head with calves thrown in free, 213 horses, and a 75% interest in ranch equipment spread across Montana and Wyoming. It was an extraordinary bargain, the kind of deal that only becomes possible when desperation meets preparation. The previous owners wanted out. Kendrick was the only one positioned to buy in. The years that followed were expansion: more land, more cattle. Partnerships with other ranchers, a position on the board of the First National Bank of Sheridan, election as president of the Wyoming Stock Growers Association in 1909, an organization that functioned as the state's real government for matters concerning land, water, and who got to use both. The Stock Growers Association shaped Wyoming law through quiet influence and occasional violence. Their hired detectives dealt with rustlers and squatters. Their lawyers wrote grazing regulations. Their members decided which small ranchers would get squeezed out and which might be allowed to survive. Kendrick was good at the game. He knew when to be generous, when to be ruthless, when to smile, and when to remain silent. He understood that power in Wyoming wasn't just about owning land. It was about controlling the narrative around land ownership. The story had to be about hardy pioneers and rugged individualism and manifest destiny. It could not be about displacement and consolidation and the systematic destruction of smaller operations that couldn't afford to fight back. By the time he started building Trail End, Kendrick was ready to cement his transformation from cowboy to cattle king. A man's home was his evidence. You couldn't argue with brick and mahogany. You couldn't debate imported limestone. Architecture was autobiography, written in materials that would outlast memory. The question was how large the house needed to be to say what Kendrick wanted said. The answer turned out to be 13,748 square feet, 30 rooms, 12 bathrooms, a ballroom occupying most of the third floor, 5 entrances, 2 architects who fought over design, materials shipped from 8 states and 3 countries, a construction timeline that would stretch 5 years instead of the planned 2, labor disputes that shut down work for 18 months, cost overruns that tripled initial estimates, and a final price tag of somewhere between $160,000 and $164,000, depending on which records you trust, at a time when a 3-bedroom house with a garage cost $4,000. That's the official story. A successful rancher builds a mansion for his family. Hard work pays off. The American dream in brick and mortar. What the official story doesn't mention is what it cost the people who built it. Glenn Charles McAllister arrived from Billings, Montana, to serve as lead architect. He designed in the Flemish Revival style, rare in the American West, but popular among European industrialists who wanted their homes to look like minor castles. The style was expensive. It required skilled bricklayers who knew the old Flemish bond pattern where headers and stretchers alternate in each course, creating a checkerboard effect that demanded precision and patience. It needed masons who could work limestone into curvilinear gables and fractables. It called for craftsmen, not laborers. McAllister brought some of those craftsmen with him. Others were imported from Nebraska and Michigan. Most of the actual labor force came from Sheridan and the surrounding areas. Men who needed work and didn't ask questions about wages or hours or working conditions because questioning meant being replaced by someone who wouldn't question. A local contractor oversaw day-to-day operations. but the Kendrick family served as their own general contractors. This was unusual for a project of this scale. It meant John Kendrick made every major decision about materials, timeline, and spending. It also meant he bore direct responsibility for everything that went wrong. Things went wrong almost immediately. McAllister and the interior designer Daniel Everett Wade, brought in from New York to handle the finishing work, couldn't agree on anything. McAllister wanted exterior grandeur. Wade wanted interior sophistication. They fought over design elements, over material choices, over whose vision would dominate. The Kendricks split the work to keep the peace, assigning McAllister to the outside and Wade to the inside, which solved the aesthetic conflict but created coordination problems that would plague the entire project. Low cattle prices in 1910 and 1911 forced construction to halt for 18 months. Kendrick couldn't afford to keep paying crews when beef wasn't selling. The partially finished mansion sat exposed to Wyoming weather, windows open, interior work incomplete, while Kendrick waited for market conditions to improve. Workers were let go without compensation. Some found other jobs. Some left Wyoming entirely. Some waited, hoping the work would resume, surviving on whatever they could scrape together. When construction restarted, many of the original workers were gone. New crews had to be trained. Quality suffered. Timelines stretched. Costs mounted. The Kendricks moved into the carriage house in 1910 because they'd already sold their previous home, and they lived there for 3 years while the main house remained unfinished. A daily reminder of how even unlimited money couldn't force a project to completion if you fired everyone who knew how the pieces fit together. Labor disputes are mentioned in the historical record, but never detailed. The phrase appears in multiple sources without explanation, as if everyone understood what it meant and no one wanted to elaborate. In the context of early 1900s construction, labor disputes typically meant one of several things: workers demanding better wages, workers protesting unsafe conditions, workers being replaced by cheaper labor, workers organizing or attempting to organize, management refusing to negotiate, local authorities intervening on behalf of ownership. Wyoming in 1910 was not friendly to labor organizing. The state's economy depended on extraction: minerals, timber, cattle, sheep. The men who controlled those industries controlled the state. They viewed workers as interchangeable parts in a machine, valuable only insofar as they produced output at the lowest possible cost. When workers pushed back, the response was swift and permanent: blacklists, replacement crews, violence if necessary. Trail ends labor disputes likely followed this pattern. Workers who demanded fair treatment got fired. Workers who organized got blacklisted. Workers who kept their heads down and accepted what was offered got to keep working, at least until the money ran out again. The mansion was built on this calculus, brick by brick, room by room, each piece of imported mahogany representing someone's decision to accept less than they deserved, because accepting less was better than getting nothing at all. The materials told their own story of global exploitation dressed up as sophistication. Indiana limestone quarried by men paid by the load, not the hour. Kansas brick made by workers in kilns that reached 2,000 degrees. Missouri roofing tiles shaped by hand because machines couldn't match the curves. Montana granite cut from mountainsides by immigrant labor too new to the country to know they were being cheated. Honduran mahogany harvested by indigenous workers for pennies while American buyers paid dollars. German silver fixtures fabricated in factories where 12-hour days were standard. Italian marble carved by artisans whose names nobody recorded. 36 boxcars of mahogany alone, each car holding approximately 50,000 board feet. That's 8 million board feet of tropical hardwood shipped to Wyoming to panel the interior of a house that would function primarily as a summer retreat. The environmental cost wasn't considered. The human cost was considered irrelevant. What mattered was the visual effect, the dark wood gleaming under custom-made chandeliers, the impression of permanence and taste and wealth so vast it could transform forests into decoration. Wade's interior design called for coffered ceilings, quarter-sawn golden oak paneling in the library, English Gothic styling with stained glass, and built-in bookcases and ceiling beams that had to be hand-carved. The drawing room got walls covered in French silk. The master bedroom got Vermont marble. The bathrooms got porcelain wall tiles, and ceramic floor tiles and German silver plumbing fixtures. Every bedroom had its own bath, an almost unheard-of luxury in 1913 Wyoming. The house incorporated every modern technology available, electric lighting throughout, supplied by Sheridan's new power plant, indoor plumbing with hot and cold running water, a coal furnace with radiators in every room, telephones in the master bedroom, library, and kitchen, an intercom system connecting all 3 floors, an elevator, a dumbwaiter, a built-in vacuum cleaning system with pipes running through the walls and floor outlets in each room so maids could plug in a hose and suck dirt into a central canister in the basement. These weren't decorative touches. They were proof of concept. Kendrick was showing Wyoming that modernity had arrived, that the frontier was over, that the state's future belonged to men who understood technology and capital and how to leverage both. Trail End was argument as architecture. Look what can be built here. Look what money can buy. Look how far we've come from the days when this was just grass and wind and people who didn't know how to use it properly. The "we" in that formulation did a lot of work. It erased the labor. It erased the displacement. It erased the cost borne by everyone except the people who benefited. It created a story where Kendrick was the hero of his own myth, the orphan who became a senator through nothing more than hard work and determination and the fundamental justice of the American system. The truth was more complicated. Kendrick did work hard. He also worked smart. He identified opportunities and exploited them. He allied with the right people. He crushed competition when he needed to. He knew when to be patient and when to strike. These are skills, and they deserve recognition. But they're not the whole story. The whole story includes the workers who built his empire and got paid subsistence wages, the small ranchers who sold out because they couldn't compete, the native populations who lost land to feed cattle that would feed East Coast markets, the women who worked as domestics in Trail End for room and board because that was the only employment available, the day workers who came in the morning and left at night because they couldn't afford to live where they worked. Trail End required constant maintenance even when new. The grounds needed tending, the house needed cleaning, the systems needed monitoring. The Kendricks employed cooks, housekeepers, maids, nurses, groundskeepers, drivers. Most were day workers who lived elsewhere in Sheridan. A few lived on site, taking part of their wages in food and shelter, working from dawn until the family was settled for the evening, then retreating to small rooms on the upper floors or in outbuildings. Eula Kendrick, contrary to the image of wealthy women as decorative objects, worked alongside the staff. This wasn't altruism. It was practicality born from her upbringing on her father's ranch where everyone worked. But it also meant she understood exactly how much labor was required to maintain the lifestyle she and her family enjoyed. She knew what it took to keep 30 rooms clean. She knew what it cost to heat 13,648 square feet through a Wyoming winter. She knew the staff weren't abstractions. They were people with lives and problems and limitations. John Kendrick knew it too. He just didn't think it changed anything. By the time Trail End was ready for occupancy on July 16, 1913, Kendrick was already deep into his political career. He'd been elected to the Wyoming State Senate in 1910. He'd run for U.S. Senate twice and lost both times, in 1911 to Clarence D. Clark and in 1912 to Francis E. Warren. He'd learned that in Wyoming politics, persistence mattered more than charisma, that showing up and doing the work and keeping your promises to the right people eventually paid off. In 1914, he was elected governor of Wyoming, the second Democratic governor in state history, representing a party that barely existed in what was fundamentally Republican territory. He won by being more conservative than most Republicans, by aligning with business interests while throwing enough bones to workers to maintain the appearance of balance. He established a public service commission. He supported surveys for irrigation and reclamation. He protested federal overreach when President Wilson withdrew public lands containing mineral rights. He backed social reforms like widows' pensions and child labor protections and workers' compensation, reforms that cost the state little but made him look progressive. 2 years later, in 1916, he was elected to the U.S. Senate, a position he would hold until his death. He resigned the governorship on February 4, 1917, having served less than a full term, eager to take his place in Washington where real power lived. Trail End became a summer home, a place to retreat when Congress wasn't in session, a symbol of Wyoming's success that he could show off to visiting colleagues and constituents and anyone else who needed to understand that he wasn't just some cowboy playing at politics. The mansion had cost him something approaching $164,000, though exact figures remain disputed. Some records say $160,000. Some say $165,000. The variance suggests either poor bookkeeping or deliberate obscuring of total costs, both plausible given the scale and complexity of the project. In today's dollars, accounting for inflation, that's roughly $4, $8 million, enough to build something extraordinary but not obscene by modern standards for the ultra-wealthy. But the comparison fails because it ignores context. $164,000 in 1913 represented 41 years of earnings for the average factory worker, making $4,000 annually. It represented the GDP of a small town. It represented wealth on a scale that most Americans couldn't conceptualize. And Kendrick spent it on a house he would barely live in. This wasn't waste, it was investment. The house was working capital, a tool for accumulating political and social influence. Every dinner party, every reception, every gathering of Wyoming's elite reinforced Kendrick's position. The ballroom wasn't just a ballroom, it was a space where deals got made and alliances formed and futures decided. The library wasn't just a library, it was where Kendrick met with constituents and lobbyists and fellow senators, where the quiet business of governance happened away from public scrutiny. Trail End functioned as a stage set for power. The audience changed depending on who was visiting, but the message remained constant. John Kendrick had arrived, and arrival meant permanence, meant belonging, meant the right to shape Wyoming's future because he'd already shaped its past. The question nobody asked publicly was what happened when the performance ended, when Kendrick died, when the money stopped flowing, when the structure became a burden instead of an asset. The answer would take decades to reveal itself, and it would be less triumphant than the story Kendrick had worked so hard to build. Senator Kendrick served in Washington from 1917 until his death in 1933, 17 years of steady if unspectacular work on behalf of Wyoming's interests as he defined them. He focused on public lands, on irrigation, on reclamation, on anything that could benefit ranchers and farmers and the extractive industries that drove the state's economy. He rarely spoke on the Senate floor. He missed roll call votes with alarming frequency. He avoided the spotlight whenever possible. His colleagues considered him quiet, methodical, someone who worked through back channels and committee meetings rather than public speeches and dramatic gestures. He was chairman of the Committee on Public Lands. He served on agriculture and forestry, on irrigation and reclamation. He got bills passed that mattered to Wyoming even if they barely registered nationally. He also began the investigation into the Teapot Dome scandal, the bribery scheme involving Secretary of the Interior Albert Fall and oil executives who leased government land for private profit. Kendrick's role was significant, though downplayed in most histories. He pushed for hearings when others wanted to let it fade. He demanded transparency when powerful people wanted silence. The scandal eventually destroyed Fall and damaged the Harding administration. But Kendrick emerged unscathed, his reputation for integrity enhanced. His name came up occasionally as a possible presidential or vice presidential candidate. In 1924, Wyoming's Democratic delegates were instructed to vote for him at the National Convention, which they did for the first 3 ballots before switching to the eventual compromise candidate. In 1928, he was considered for the vice presidential spot that went to Senate Minority Leader Joseph Taylor Robinson. Neither possibility was serious. Kendrick was a regional figure, too identified with Western interests and too lacking in national charisma to survive presidential politics. He said he planned to retire at the end of his 3rd term in 1934. He was 76, the oldest serving senator. He wanted to return to Sheridan, to Trail End, to spend time with his grandchildren and manage his ranches and enjoy whatever years remained. Friends and family noticed he looked exhausted. They encouraged him to slow down. He didn't. On the evening of November 1st, 1933, Kendrick collapsed in his downtown Sheridan office, complaining of a severe headache. He slipped into a coma and died 2 days later, surrounded by immediate family. The official cause was cerebral hemorrhage, though initial reports mentioned uremia, a kidney condition that causes toxins to build up in the blood. The discrepancy was never explained. Kendrick was buried in Mount Hope Cemetery in Sheridan. Tributes poured in from across Wyoming and Washington. Governor Edwin C. Johnson praised his service. Memorial services were held in the House of Representatives. Newspapers ran long obituaries detailing his rise from poverty to power. The story was clean and inspiring and incomplete. What the tributes didn't mention was the financial situation Kendrick left behind. The ranching empire was intact but operating on increasingly thin margins. The Depression had crushed beef prices. Land values had collapsed. Operating costs remained high. The Kendrick Cattle Company was land-rich and cash-poor, a common condition for Western ranches during the 1930s, but particularly acute for operations as large as Kendrick's. Trail End itself was a financial drain. The property taxes were substantial. Maintenance costs were astronomical. Heating the mansion through Wyoming winters consumed coal by the ton. Staffing required constant payroll. The systems that had been modern in 1913 were aging by 1933, requiring repairs and replacements that grew more expensive as parts became harder to find. Eula Kendrick moved back to Trail End with her son Manville and his family. She would live there for the next 28 years until her death in 1961 at the age of 89. Manville managed what remained of the cattle operations. His wife Diana raised their children, John and Hugh, in the mansion where their grandfather had entertained senators and governors. The house remained in use, but its purpose had changed. It was no longer a symbol of arriving power. It was a reminder of departed glory. The Kendrick Cattle Company limped through the Depression and the war years and the post-war boom. The ranches stayed productive. The cattle brought fair prices when markets allowed. But the economics of ranching were changing. Larger operations could achieve economies of scale that even a 210,000-acre empire couldn't match. Competition from feedlots and industrial agriculture made traditional range ranching less profitable. Property taxes rose, labor costs increased. Environmental regulations, minimal as they were, created new compliance expenses. By the late 1980s, the family faced a choice. They could continue fighting diminishing returns, pouring money into operations that barely broke even, or they could sell while buyers still existed. In 1988, almost a century after John Kendrick first brought his herds to Hanging Woman Creek, the family decided to end the cattle operations. Livestock and equipment were auctioned. The land was divided into 6 parcels and sold for an estimated $8 million. Trail End was already gone by then. Eula died in 1961. Manville and his family moved out. For 7 years, the house sat empty, too expensive to maintain and too specific in design to attract buyers. The mansion was scheduled for demolition in 1968 when the Sheridan County Historical Society intervened, purchasing the property in what was described as the 11th hour, saving it from destruction. The Historical Society opened Trail End as a community museum in 1969. They spent considerable money stabilizing the structure and restoring enough of the interior to make it presentable to visitors. The Kendrick family donated furnishings and memorabilia, relieved that the house would be preserved even if they could no longer afford to keep it. But preservation has a price. The Historical Society quickly discovered that maintaining a 13,748 square foot mansion built in 1913 with aging systems and materials that were expensive, when new and nearly impossible to replace decades later, consumed resources faster than admission fees and donations could provide them. In 1982, the Historical Society transferred ownership to the state of Wyoming. The expense of caring for Trail End had become unsustainable for a volunteer organization with limited funding. The state took over, finishing the restoration work and converting the mansion into a state historic site managed by the Wyoming Department of State Parks and Cultural Resources. The state's involvement meant taxpayer funding. Every dollar spent maintaining Trail End was a dollar that could have gone to schools, roads, healthcare, or any number of other public needs. The decision to preserve the mansion reflected Wyoming's priorities, a choice to honor the legacy of wealthy cattlemen and politicians over more immediate concerns. Whether this was the right choice depends on what you believe historical preservation is for. One argument says Trail end represents Wyoming's history and deserves protection regardless of cost. The mansion tells the story of the state's development, of how the cattle industry shaped politics and culture, of the role that individual ambition played in transforming frontier territory into modern state. Losing Trail End would mean losing a tangible connection to that history, reducing everything to photographs and written records that lack the visceral impact of walking through rooms where actual events occurred. Another argument says, Trail End represents a very specific version of Wyoming's history, the version where wealthy white men are heroes and everyone else is background scenery. The mansion celebrates accumulation while ignoring extraction. It honors one family's success while erasing the labor that made that success possible. Preserving it with public money means asking everyone to subsidize a monument to inequality. Both arguments have merit. History is complicated. The question isn't whether Trail End should be preserved, but what story we tell when we preserve it. The current interpretation at Trail End attempts balance. Exhibits discuss the Kendrick family's rise and their role in Wyoming politics. They also acknowledge the labor required to build and maintain the mansion, the servants who worked there, the economic context that made such extreme wealth disparity possible. Tours mention the skilled craftsmen who created the architectural details and the less skilled workers who did the heavy lifting. The story isn't sanitized, but it also isn't condemnatory. It presents facts and lets visitors draw conclusions. This approach has limitations. Facts without context can feel sterile. Context without judgment can feel dishonest. Visitors see beautiful rooms and impressive craftsmanship, and they hear about the Kendrick family's accomplishments, and they might leave thinking the story is fundamentally positive, that John Kendrick's life proves anyone can make it if they work hard enough and get lucky at the right moments. That's not wrong exactly, it's just incomplete. The full story includes all the people who worked just as hard and didn't get lucky. The small ranchers who sold out. The cowboys who worked for wages that barely covered food and shelter. The domestic workers who cleaned other people's homes because that was the only work available to them. The native populations who lost land to make room for cattle. The laborers who built the mansion and then went home to houses worth a fraction of what they'd created for someone else. Trail End cost approximately $164,000 to build in 1913. Maintaining it as a state historic site costs Wyoming taxpayers over $200,000 annually in operating expenses, not including major restoration projects that run into millions. The site receives approximately 15,000 to 20,000 visitors each year. Admission is free, though donations are encouraged. The mathematics are straightforward. The state spends roughly $10 to $13 per visitor to maintain Trail End. This doesn't include the initial acquisition and restoration costs or the property taxes the state forgoes by keeping the land in public ownership. It's subsidized history, paid for by people who may never visit the mansion and may have ancestors who suffered under the economic system it represents. Is that cost justified? That depends on what you think society owes to the past and how you weigh competing claims on public resources. Trail End serves educational purposes. It employs staff and supports local tourism. It preserves architectural heritage. These have value. Whether they have enough value to justify the expense is a political question, not a historical one. What's certain is that the Kendrick family couldn't afford to keep Trail End. Wealth that seemed permanent in 1913 proved temporary by 1968. The operating costs that seemed manageable when cattle prices were high became crushing when prices collapsed. The mansion that represented success became a burden, something to be shed before it dragged the entire family legacy down with it. This pattern repeats across American history. Gilded Age mansions, robber baron estates, industrial fortunes built on extraction and exploitation. They rise spectacular and confident and sure of their own permanence. They fall slowly, gradually, as maintenance costs compound and descendants scatter, and the economic conditions that created them change. They end up as museums if they're lucky, demolished if they're not, either way no longer serving the purpose for which they were built. Trail End was supposed to be John Kendrick's monument. Instead, it became Wyoming's burden. The state keeps it running because letting it collapse would feel like failure, like admitting that not everything worth preserving can be preserved, that sometimes the cost exceeds the value no matter how much history might be lost. Visitors walk through Trail End today and see elegance. They see craftsmanship. They see a time capsule from an era when wealthy families lived in houses that required teams of servants, and when that arrangement was considered not just normal, but aspirational. They see mahogany paneling and stained glass, and a ballroom where Sheridan's elite once gathered. What they might not see is the cost, not just the $164,000 construction price or the ongoing taxpayer subsidy, the human cost. The workers who built it, the people who maintained it, the families who lived in houses worth less than what Kendrick spent on the library, the indigenous populations who lost land so cattle could graze, the small ranchers who couldn't compete with operations the size of the Kendrick Cattle Company, the women who worked as domestics because other opportunities didn't exist, the children who inherited wealth they didn't earn and burdens they couldn't escape. That cost was real. It's still real. It's built into every brick and every board foot of mahogany. It's written in the historical record if you know where to look. It's visible in the gap between what John Kendrick earned and what the people who worked for him earned. It's audible in the silence around labor disputes that halted construction for 18 months. It's tangible in the fact that the mansion is public property now because private ownership became unsustainable. Trail End stands on Clarendon Avenue overlooking Sheridan because John Kendrick wanted everyone to see it. He wanted the visibility. He wanted the monument. He got both. What he didn't account for was who would have to pay to keep the monument standing after he was gone. The answer turned out to be everyone. The taxpayers who fund the state historic site, the workers whose labor built the original structure without fair compensation, the families displaced by the consolidation of land into cattle empires, the descendants who inherited a legacy complicated by how it was built. History isn't clean. It's not a story with heroes and villains and simple moral lessons. It's messy and contradictory and full of people making choices that made sense at the time but looked different with distance. John Kendrick was ambitious and smart and ruthless when necessary. He created jobs and built an industry and served his state in ways that mattered. He also accumulated wealth through systems that exploited labor and displaced populations and concentrated resources in the hands of people who already had more than they needed. Both things are true. Acknowledging one doesn't erase the other. Trail End is beautiful, and it's built on suffering. It's historically significant, and it's morally complicated. It deserves preservation, and it represents everything wrong with how wealth concentrates and persists across generations at the expense of people who have no choice but to accept what's offered. The mansion doesn't resolve these contradictions. It embodies them. Walking through its rooms means confronting what America was and is and might be. Wealth and poverty existing side by side. Beauty created through exploitation. History preserved at public expense while immediate needs go unmet. Monuments to individual achievement that ignore collective cost. Maybe that's the value in keeping Trail End open, not as celebration, but as evidence, not as inspiration, but as warning. Look what was built and look what it required. Look who benefited and look who paid. Look how long it lasted under private ownership and look who had to step in when the family could no longer afford their own monument. The house tells the truth if you're willing to hear it. Not the sanitized version where hard work automatically leads to success and wealth is its own justification. The complicated version where systems matter more than individuals and where the cost of one person's dream becomes everyone else's debt. Trail End sits on its hilltop, perfectly maintained by state employees, visited by tourists who pay nothing for admission, funded by taxpayers who may never walk through its doors. The irony is thick enough to cut. A mansion built by a cattle baron through private enterprise survives only through public subsidy. The monument to individualism persists because the collective agreed to carry the burden. John Kendrick wanted immortality. He wanted his name attached to something that would outlast him. He got his wish. Trail End stands. His legacy continues. Visitors remember his name, if not always the details of what he did. But immortality has conditions. The house survives because it stopped being his and became ours. The legacy continues because we choose to maintain it. The memory persists because the state decided it was worth preserving despite the cost. That's not the triumph Kendrick imagined when he commissioned the mansion in 1908. It's something smaller and stranger and more honest. A reminder that private wealth eventually becomes public responsibility, that monuments require maintenance, that nothing lasts without someone willing to pay for its survival. The question remains whether that payment is worth making, whether Trail End serves enough educational and cultural purpose to justify its ongoing cost, whether preserving the legacy of wealthy cattlemen matters more than funding schools or fixing roads or providing services to people who need them now rather than celebrating people who succeeded a century ago. Wyoming keeps making the choice to preserve Trail End. The state budget includes line items for operation and maintenance. Staff gets hired and trained. Restoration projects get funded. The mansion endures. That choice reflects values. History matters. Heritage deserves protection. Some things shouldn't be reduced to pure cost-benefit analysis. The intangible value of connection to the past, of being able to walk through spaces where actual events occurred, of seeing how people lived and understanding how different the past really was, that has worth that transcends annual operating budgets. But it also reflects whose history gets preserved and whose gets forgotten, whose stories deserve brick-and-mortar permanence and whose make do with oral tradition and fading photographs, whose legacy becomes public property and whose disappears when the last person who remembers them dies. Trail End stands because John Kendrick had money and power and the foresight to build something substantial enough to survive his death. The workers who built it have no monument. The small ranchers who lost land to Kendrick's expansion have no museum. The domestic workers who cleaned the mansion have no historical marker. Their stories exist in archives if you look. In wage records and census data and occasional newspaper mentions. They exist in the structure itself, in the brickwork and the mahogany and the limestone, evidence of skilled hands and long hours and work that paid less than it should have. They exist in the absences, in what's not displayed and not discussed and not honored with plaques or guided tours. Preserving Trail End means deciding that Kendrick's story matters more than theirs. Not more valuable, necessarily, but more worthy of expensive permanent remembrance. That's a choice, not an inevitability. Wyoming could let Trail End decay, could sell it, could repurpose it, could tell different stories with different emphases. The state chooses continuity instead, maintaining the mansion as it was, interpreting it as carefully as possible, but ultimately reinforcing the narrative that made Kendrick famous in the first place. Maybe that's appropriate. Maybe preserving complicated history means keeping it complicated, presenting the facts and acknowledging the gaps and trusting visitors to think critically about what they're seeing. Maybe the best we can do with structures like Trail End is ensure they don't become simple celebrations, that the labor gets mentioned and the costs get discussed and the story doesn't flatten into myth. Or maybe preservation itself is the problem. Maybe turning exploitation into education doesn't change what it was. Maybe maintaining monuments to wealth inequality with public funds is just another form of the same system, finding new ways to make everyone pay for what benefits the few. These aren't easy questions, and they don't have clear answers. What's certain is that Trail End exists because people keep choosing to maintain it. The mansion doesn't stand on its own merits. It stands because Wyoming taxpayers fund its survival, because state employees work to preserve it, because volunteers serve as docents and board members, because visitors keep coming to see it. Every person who walks through Trail End makes a choice about what the mansion means: historical treasure or monument to exploitation, educational resource or expensive vanity project, connection to the past or reinforcement of whose past matters. All of the above, none of the above. Something different entirely. The brick doesn't care. The mahogany doesn't judge. The house stands regardless of how we interpret it. But interpretation matters because it shapes what we learn and what we value and what we choose to preserve going forward. Trail End will likely survive as long as Wyoming exists as a state. The political costs of demolishing or abandoning such a prominent historical structure outweigh the financial burden of maintaining it. Future generations will walk through the same rooms, see the same furnishings, hear variations of the same stories. What they'll make of those stories depends on the world they inherit and the values they bring. Maybe they'll see Trail End as a charming relic from a time when things were simpler. Maybe they'll see it as evidence of systemic inequality that persists despite claiming to be over. Maybe they'll see both and struggle to reconcile them like we do now. Or maybe they'll see something we can't because distance provides perspective that proximity prevents. Maybe the full cost of trail end won't be calculable until enough time passes that we can measure not just the construction expense or the maintenance budget, but the opportunity cost. What else might have been built or funded or achieved if the resources had flowed differently? That's unknowable now. What we can know is what's visible. A mansion on a hill. A monument that outlasted the man who built it. A story that's more complicated than it appears. A legacy that asks more questions than it answers. The numbers tell their own story if you let them accumulate. Trail End consists of 13,748 square feet across 3 levels. 30 rooms total, though the exact count varies depending on whether you include bathrooms and closets and service spaces. 12 full or partial bathrooms, extraordinary luxury for 1913 when most Wyoming homes had outdoor privies. 5 separate entrances because the help couldn't use the same doors as the family. A ballroom occupying nearly the entire 3rd floor, approximately 2,000 square feet of open space designed for entertaining Sheridan's elite and visiting dignitaries from Washington. The construction materials came from everywhere except Wyoming. Indiana limestone for the foundation, quarried from formations laid down 350 million years ago and cut by men paid $1.50 per 10-hour day. Kansas brick made from clay deposits along the Arkansas River, formed in kilns heated by coal, mined by other poorly paid workers. Missouri roofing tiles shaped by hand because mass production couldn't match the curves required by Flemish Revival architecture. Montana granite from quarries that would later be abandoned when cheaper alternatives became available. 36 boxcars of Honduran mahogany, each car representing weeks of labor by indigenous workers cutting old-growth trees in rainforests that will never recover from the extraction. German silver fixtures manufactured in factories where workers breathed metal dust that would later give them lung diseases nobody connected to workplace exposure. Italian marble carved by artisans whose skill kept them employed but not prosperous. The human cost of assembling these materials is impossible to calculate precisely because nobody tracked it. How many workers quarried the limestone? How many fired the brick kilns? How many shaped the tiles and cut the granite and harvested the mahogany and fabricated the fixtures and carved the marble? How many were injured or killed in industrial accidents that were considered normal business costs? How many developed long-term health problems from exposure to dust and chemicals and brutal working conditions? We don't know, because it didn't matter to the people who bought the materials. What mattered was the price and the quality and the delivery schedule. Trail End took 5 years to complete instead of the planned 2. Construction began in 1908. The house was ready for occupancy on July 16, 1913. That's 1,225 days, though actual work probably totaled closer to 1,100 days given the 18-month shutdown in 1910 and 1911. Multiple crews working simultaneously on different parts of the structure. Foundation work, bricklaying, roofing, interior framing, electrical installation, plumbing, carpentry, plastering, painting, each trade requiring specialized knowledge and skilled execution. The local workforce handled most of the basic construction, excavation, foundation pouring, bricklaying. Rough carpentry, jobs that required strength and endurance more than specialized training. These workers came from Sheridan and the surrounding area, men who needed work and took what was offered. Wages varied depending on skill level, but probably ranged from $2 to $4 per day for a 10-hour shift, standard rates for construction labor in early 1900s Wyoming. That's 20 cents to 40 cents per hour. A skilled bricklayer might make more. An unskilled laborer might make less. Compare that to the $160,000 to $164,000 total construction cost, the equivalent of roughly 4 million worker hours at the bottom of the pay scale, or 2 million hours at the top. Even allowing for material costs consuming half to 2/3 of the budget, that still represents somewhere between 650,000 and 3 million labor hours translated into a mansion that John Kendrick would use primarily as a summer retreat between Washington sessions. The skilled craftsmen imported from Nebraska and Michigan commanded higher wages but worked under similar conditions. 10 to 12-hour days, 6 days a week, sometimes 7 during crucial phases when weather or deadlines demanded it. They lived in temporary housing or local boarding houses, sent most of their pay home to families they saw only between jobs, and moved on when the work was finished. Their names appear in payroll records if those records still exist, which is doubtful given how many construction companies from that era have long since dissolved. The craftsmanship they produced is visible throughout Trail End. Hand-carved mahogany staircases with balusters, turned on lathes and fitted so precisely that gaps are invisible. Coffered ceilings with each panel slightly different because handwork always varies. Stained glass windows in the library with lead came soldered at joints that have held for over a century. Plasterwork with details so fine they look machine-made but aren't. Tile work in 12 bathrooms with patterns that required planning and precision and patience to execute. This level of finish didn't happen by accident. It required time and skill and supervision and constant attention to quality. It also required workers willing to do meticulous labor for wages that barely covered living expenses. The mathematics of craft work in the early 1900s depended on abundance of skilled labor and scarcity of opportunities. If you could do good work but competitors were plentiful, employers could push wages down because someone else would always work for less. The only leverage was reputation, the possibility that excellent craftsmanship might lead to future employment. Most workers never achieved that level of distinction. They did good work for minimal pay and disappeared into history without recognition. The systems installed in Trail End represented cutting-edge technology for 1913. Electric lighting throughout, powered by Sheridan's municipal system, which had only been installed a few years earlier. Indoor plumbing with hot water heated by the coal furnace, a luxury most Sheridan residents wouldn't enjoy for another decade. Central heating with radiators in every room instead of fireplaces and wood stoves. An intercom system using primitive electrical circuits to connect different floors. Telephones in multiple rooms, sophisticated for a time when most homes had no phones at all. An elevator, rare in private residences, installed primarily for Eula Kendrick's convenience as she managed the household. A dumbwaiter connecting the kitchen to upper floors for moving food and supplies. A built-in vacuum system with central collector and wall outlets on each floor. Installing these systems required electricians, plumbers, steam fitters, specialists who understood new technologies that most construction crews had never encountered. These workers commanded premium wages, $3 to $5 per day, maybe more for particularly complex installations. But even premium wages in 1913 were modest compared to what Kendrick spent on materials. The limestone foundation alone probably cost more than the entire labor budget for installing electrical systems. Priorities were clear. Materials lasted forever and impressed visitors. Workers were temporary and invisible. Daniel Everett Wade, the interior designer from New York, brought his own aesthetic and his own conflicts. Wade had worked on major projects across the Northeast, designing interiors for wealthy clients who wanted European sophistication transplanted to American settings. He understood how to create spaces that communicated wealth and taste and cultural refinement. He also understood that provincial clients like the Kendricks needed guidance, that left to their own devices, they might make choices that satisfied them but embarrassed him professionally. The tension between Wade's vision and the Kendricks' preferences created ongoing friction. Wade wanted restraint and elegance. The Kendricks wanted visible luxury. Wade suggested French silk for one room. Eula Kendrick wanted it everywhere. Wade proposed subtle color palettes. John Kendrick wanted bold statements. They compromised, which meant Wade got some of what he wanted, and the Kendricks got more of what they wanted. And the result was a house that mixed sophistication with showiness in ways that wouldn't satisfy purists on either side, but worked well enough for a Wyoming cattle baron trying to prove he belonged among the nation's elite. Wade's fee isn't recorded, but interior designers of his stature typically charged 10 to 20% of project costs, which would put his compensation somewhere between $16,000 and $32,000. That's more than most workers would earn in 20 years. It also reflects market value for specialized expertise. Wade could do things the Kendricks couldn't, and they were willing to pay for the results. Whether the results justified the cost depends on what you think interior design is worth. But there's no question that Wade's work elevated Trail End beyond what local craftsmen could have achieved working without his direction. Glenn Charles McAllister, the architect, faced similar tensions. He designed buildings across Montana, mostly commercial structures and a few grand homes, but nothing on the scale of Trail End. The commission was career-making if he succeeded, and career-damaging if he failed. He needed the Kendricks to be satisfied. He also needed the building to showcase his abilities to potential future clients. These incentives aligned with producing quality work, but diverged on questions of cost and schedule. McAllister wanted to build slowly, carefully, taking time to get details right. The Kendricks wanted the house finished before John's political career took him to Washington. Neither got exactly what they wanted. The 18-month shutdown in 1910 and 1911 gave McAllister time to refine his plans, but destroyed the construction timeline. When work resumed, everyone was behind schedule and over budget, and frustrated with delays that seemed endless. McAllister's fee also isn't recorded, but architects typically charged 5 to 10% of construction costs, putting his compensation somewhere between $8,000 and $16,000, a substantial sum but less than Wade's fee, despite McAllister's work being arguably more fundamental to the project's success. The discrepancy reflects how the market valued different kinds of expertise. Interior design was seen as more sophisticated, more artistic, more culturally refined than architectural engineering. Both were necessary, but one commanded higher prices. The final cost of $160,000 to $164,000 represented John Kendrick's total investment in Trail End, but that figure doesn't capture the full expense, the opportunity cost of capital tied up in construction for 5 years, the carrying costs of land purchased in 1895 that sat unused for 13 years, the expense of living in the carriage house for 3 years while waiting for the main house to be finished. The political cost of being seen as extravagant during a period when Kendrick was cultivating an image as a man of the people who understood ordinary Wyoming concerns. There were also hidden subsidies. The railroad gave favorable rates for shipping materials because Kendrick was a major customer for moving cattle to market. Local suppliers offered discounts because Kendrick's business was too valuable to lose. Contractors absorbed some cost overruns rather than risk damaging relationships with Wyoming's most powerful cattlemen. These advantages didn't appear in the official ledger, but they reduced the real price Kendrick paid. Trail End was complete by July 1913. The family moved in. For 16 months, from summer 1913 through fall 1914, they used the mansion as intended, a primary residence where John Kendrick conducted business, and Eula Kendrick managed the household, and Rosa May and Manville attended Sheridan schools, and lived lives appropriate to children of Wyoming's wealthiest families. Then Kendrick was elected governor in November 1914. The family moved to Cheyenne. Trail End became a summer home, a place to retreat between legislative sessions and political obligations. The mansion sat empty most of the year, maintained by skeleton crews, its rooms gathering dust while Kendrick worked in the capital and lived in the governor's residence and navigated the strange transition from cattle baron to elected official. The shift from private businessman to public servant required adjustments. Kendrick could no longer make decisions based solely on profit. He had to consider constituents and political allies, and party interests and public opinion. He had to explain his positions and defend his votes and maintain relationships with people who didn't care about cattle prices or land management, but cared deeply about roads and schools and taxes. He had to pretend that being governor of Wyoming was more important than running the Kendrick Cattle Company, even though the cattle company represented his real power and the governorship was mostly symbolic. He managed the transition competently, if not brilliantly. He established a public service commission to regulate utilities and railroads. He supported surveys to identify sites for irrigation and reclamation projects. He protested when President Woodrow Wilson withdrew public lands containing mineral rights, a move that threatened Wyoming's extractive industries and the men who profited from them. He backed social reforms that cost the state little but made him look progressive: widows' pensions, child labor protections, workers' compensation. He played the game well enough to position himself for higher office. In 1916, he ran for U.S. Senate and won, defeating incumbent Francis E. Warren, a remarkable achievement for a Democrat in heavily Republican Wyoming. He resigned the governorship on February 4, 1917, having served less than a full term, eager to take his seat in Washington, where real power lived, and real decisions got made. Trail End became even more of a summer retreat, used primarily during congressional recesses when Kendrick returned to Wyoming to maintain political connections and check on his ranching operations. The mansion had cost $164,000 to build. Kendrick would spend perhaps 6 months total living there between 1913 and his death in 1933. That's roughly 20 years of paying property taxes and maintenance costs and staffing expenses for a house used less than 3% of the time. The mathematics made no economic sense unless you understood that Trail End wasn't about economics. It was about visibility and prestige and leaving something permanent that would outlast its builder. Trail End stands because John Kendrick was determined to build something permanent. He succeeded. The mansion is permanent, at least as permanent as anything human beings create can be. But permanence came at a price he never fully paid, and a cost his descendants couldn't bear, and a burden that passed to everyone else. That's the dark story behind the grand architecture. That's the hidden expense beneath the polished mahogany. That's the truth that preservation alone won't change. Trail End is beautiful and impressive and historically significant. It's also a monument to a system where some people accumulate wealth by extracting it from others, where success for one family means sacrifice for hundreds of families whose names we'll never know, where the privilege of visiting a mansion is paid for by people who will never have the privilege of owning one. The house doesn't apologize. Houses never do. They stand and they wait, and they endure. They tell whatever story we choose to hear, whether that's triumph or tragedy, or something more nuanced that doesn't fit neatly into either category. Trail End tells all of those stories because they're all true. The mansion is evidence of what one determined man could achieve with enough ruthlessness and enough luck and enough willingness to let other people pay the price. It's evidence of beautiful craftsmanship created by skilled workers who deserved better compensation than they got. It's evidence of a political and economic system that concentrated wealth and power in ways that seemed natural at the time, but look increasingly grotesque with distance. And it's evidence of our present choices. We keep Trail End standing, we fund its preservation, we visit and we learn and we try to understand what it means. Those are active decisions, not passive inheritance. Every year, Wyoming chooses Trail End over other possible uses of public resources. Every visitor chooses to spend time engaging with this particular piece of history. Those choices matter. They shape what endures and what fades. They determine whose stories get told and whose get forgotten. They create the legacy that future generations will inherit, just as we inherited the legacy of the choices made by people who came before us. Trail End is that inheritance made visible: stone and brick and mahogany, elegance and exploitation, beauty and burden, monument and warning. All of it coexisting in 13,000 square feet on a hilltop overlooking Sheridan, Wyoming, waiting for anyone willing to look at it and see not just what it was built to be, but what it actually cost, and who's still paying for it.